Online Safety Act, or indeed Online Safety Day, which is, of course, what LBC is doing this morning, all day, for the second time, would ordinarily lend itself to fairly straightforward questions. But I just want to do some thinking with you, if that's okay. And I will obviously need quite a lot of help from you, because nobody wants to listen to me thinking for the best part of an hour. Not even me. My first thought was that there are two very, very contradictory positions here. So I was going to open by telling you something that happened this weekend, and I was going to do it, I fear, in a slightly sniggery way. And then it occurred to me, as I was walking down the stairs, that as well as asking the question of whether or not the Online Safety Act is working, or indeed how we might know that it is, I also want to measure or track or certainly report some of the damage that the internet itself has done. And that automatically feels too huge even to contemplate, right? But if you break it down into pornography, both, I suppose, I mean, how would you describe it? Both traditional, is that the word that you'd use? And extraordinary, hideous and normal. You could break it down into some of the sites that encourage young people to harm themselves or to develop eating disorders, all sorts of areas in which really, really bad stuff happens. And the question of the impact that it could have on you. And then the generational question kicked in, which is how do you explain to a 50-year-old, 53-year-old, 60-year-old, 45-year-old, how do you explain to a middle-aged person what it's like to grow up with this level of access to a potentially very extreme pornography? And I don't know which one to choose. All of those seem relevant to me. So we'll start with the Online Safety Act, but I want you to bear in mind that I am interested in how... In fact, let's get that question sort of just fermenting, if you like, in your mind. How would you explain? Because I haven't got a clue. You know, and this is where I worry about the sniggery, or indeed, as many of you are pointing out, the new word, of course, is sniggerly. Now I'm worried about that slightly English or British end-of-peer approach that we have to almost all matters sexual. Yeah, you might not, but I think I'm probably a little bit guilty of it. This notion that you have two completely different universes. The universe of people who grew up with access to internet pornography and the universe of people who didn't. They may have discovered it subsequently, let's be honest. Most people have. But, you know, you used to sort of get excited when you were young, if you're close to my age, about the lingerie pages in a mail order catalogue. Just think about that for a moment. The lingerie pages, the models wearing lingerie in a mail order catalogue would be about as risque or about as saucy the material that your 13-year-old boy in 1985 would get access to, unless, you know, his dad had a stash of dirty magazines in the garden shed, or you found one in his bedside cabinet, or whatever it may be. Even largely even before video became a thing. That took place in the next sort of 4 or 5 years. Don't question me on the dates, all right? I'm thinking out loud. And therefore, you know, the magazines that were on the top shelf in W.H. Smith's, and which you used to sort of look at with this wistful air of exotic. God, imagine getting your hands on one of those. That would be incredible. And that was the experience for every man, more or less, as I say, unless your dad had a sack full of them in the loft. For the record, mine categorically didn't, or if he did, I never saw them. That was your experience. And then it's almost impossible to track. I presume someone's written a book about it. And then things didn't it wasn't really a boiled frog, was it? It was as if there were a tsunami of boiling water that just washed over the entire population, because you fast forward a few years and lo and behold, you can watch on a screen in your home and anywhere else in the world these days sexual activity between adults of every imaginable variety. Every imaginable variety. Think about that for a minute. Listen, I know I'm preaching to the choir. You know all this. If you're young, you might not. Sometimes when I tell younger colleagues things, not to do with pornography, that would be a very weird thing to do, but just to do with technology, they look at me as if I'm speaking Chinese. They can't quite believe it. For example, you're bored of hearing this, I imagine, but when I did my first shifts on national newspapers, there was no internet in the office. If you wanted to do a search, what would now be a Google search or a search engine operation, you did it entirely on paper. You filled in a chit, you took it to a library, and you were handed piles of newspaper cuttings that contained the subject heading that you had filled in on the chit, or the individual's name. You might write Boris Becker, and you'd get pretty much every article that had ever been written about Boris Becker, or you could specify time periods, everything about Boris Becker in the last 12 months or whatever it may be. So imagine that. Imagine just for a minute, because sometimes we need to stop and sort of smell the coffee, don't we, or clock the change. Someone who'd been asleep for 40 years wakes up this morning and says, what the hell is online safety data? We're very worried about the access that young people have to profoundly or potentially very disturbing images, including sexual images. What? How do they get that? What do they do? You just had to find a copy of Razzle in a hedge in my day if you were lucky. And the world could not be more different. It simply could not be more different. Could it? And I wonder if it's almost like asking somebody to explain cricket to a Frenchman. It's these experiences are so alien. Don't at me if you're a Frenchman who loves cricket. These experiences are so alien that you don't realise the need, or you can't approach the need for explanation. Do you see what I mean? I mean, what do you mean you want me to explain? It's like asking me to explain breathing, a young person might say. It's so omnipresent. It's so obvious. There'll be some slight differences in age. I wonder whether young people today benefit from having slightly more tech-savvy parents than people who today are in their 30s might have, for example. There's sort of slightly long periods where everything felt like the time you got a video recorder and your dad asked you to program it because he hadn't got a clue what to do, and the young people suddenly assumed the mantle of power and knowledge that had previously been reserved for the older generation, for the older people. But I say, since you're listening to this now, a young person listening to this now, there's a slight risk of you not having the first idea what I'm talking about. Sorry, what do you want me to explain, Grandad? The internet? No, I want us all to reflect on, because it doesn't have to have been your experience. You could have watched what it did to your child. You could have watched what it's done to your family. What was it like to grow up with this absolutely unfettered access to everything under the sun? Beban Kidron is the crossbench peer who played a key role in shaping the new legislation. And I read an interview with her last month, actually, that really stuck with me. She said no one a year ago believed that you could redesign the digital world so it didn't splurge self-harm, suicide and pornography at a particular demographic. This was in the House of Lords. And then she said, guess what? We can. Now, there's another question there, which, of course, you will have spotted as soon as I did, which is can we? Is it actually working? Is the enforcement of regulations contained within the Online Safety Act, most obviously the requirement to verify users' ages before they can access adult content, is it actually working? Now, we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, can we? Obviously, you will still be exposed to dodgy content. Nick did an item today, I think, with Henry, and there is still there. It's not as bad as it was 6 months ago or 12 months ago, but you can still find it. And that brings me to my own weekend, when a pal of mine just sort of dropped into conversation that he hasn't looked at any pornography online or offline, I imagine. I didn't quiz him on it, since the age verification requirement came in. He said, I'm just not comfortable clocking my face on there. And that's an impact on adults. He argued, obviously as a good Catholic boy, I have no idea what he's talking about, but his point was it had actually been quite liberating for him, and he was quite surprised to find how enthralled he had been to low level but regular access to pornography. And if it's having that impact on older people, The problem we've got as well, of course, is that 14-year-old boys can't really ring me, and even if they could, they probably wouldn't want to talk about this. You know, young teenagers are unlikely to ring a national radio station to talk about their habits in this department. So that, of course, poses the next question. How do we know it's working? How do we know if it's working? How would we track it? So there's 3 questions there. Special prize for anyone who's actually managed to focus on all 3 of them. How would you explain it? So you're 30 years younger than me or more, and you grew up with potentially with completely untrammeled access to pornography, when for every previous generation, going back forever, it was something that was clandestine and covert. You know, if you had particular enthusiasms, you had to go to special shops in urban back streets or make your way to an outlet in London's fashionable Soho. You had to really put in the effort to access the material, whereas for millions of young people around the world, you didn't have to put in any effort at all. So you can say to me, you just get a VPN and you can carry on accessing it, but you're already in a category that's different from the main, that's different from the mean. That's effort. You're putting in effort. I'm talking about growing up in a world where there was no effort needed at all. 0345 6060 973. If you can have a crack at explaining, and you don't have to be in the relevant demographic. You might be an expert, or you might be an observer, or you might be a parent that's watched it. Just explain the difference and potentially perhaps the damage done by growing up in a world with absolutely, as Beban Kidron puts it rather well, a digital world that splurges pornography at a particular demographic, potentially 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Just try and explain it. Fred in Guildford points out, we grew up with page 3. You know, topless women on page 3 of a national newspaper. And that was risque. That had a frisson to it. That was there literally to provide titillation. Seems almost comical now, but it was real, and it was the only opportunity some people got to see a woman without any clothes on her top half. Extraordinary difference. I almost struggle to articulate it. I mean, and I know you know, I don't need to articulate it, but how do you put into words the difference that makes? 16 minutes after 10 is the time. How much damage, or what damage did it do to you? And not just the pornography. The violence, I think, can be particularly horrible. The shock horror stuff that you stumble across or you start searching for, the algorithm starts feeding, the self-harm, the suicide, the eating disorder content. What damage has that done in your life? And then finally, how do we know if it's working? How will we know? How will we know? Beban Kidron, who knows of what she speaks, Baroness Beban Kidron, a long-time child safety campaigner, said a year ago, no one believed you could redesign the digital world so it didn't splurge self-harm, suicide and pornography at a particular demographic. Guess what? She asked. We can. Having willfully ignored it for at least 2 or 3 decades. Is it working?